Every lost thing has a way of finding its way back, sometimes carrying the weight of an entire life with it. The hospital corridor stretched out in silence, pale walls reflecting the low hum of fluorescent lights. The air carried a faint blend of disinfectant and warm linen, a mixture both sharp and oddly comforting. At this late hour, the world inside seemed to shrink to the rhythm of distant footsteps and the quiet rolling of carts. He walked through it with the same polished stride he carried into boardrooms, his tailored coat falling neatly over his shoulders, his shoes clicking lightly against the waxed floor. It was supposed to be a quick visit, a check-in with the Foundation's medical wing he had funded, nothing more. His mind was already moving on to the late-night meeting waiting at his office downtown. And then he heard it. "Hey son," a voice called out, frail, wavering but deliberate. "You left your toy with me." The words pulled at him with an odd familiarity. He slowed, almost against his will, the sharpness of his stride dissolving into hesitation. His eyes shifted toward the sound. An old woman sat on a bench, pressed against the wall, her frame small beneath a faded cardigan. Her hands rested on her lap, folded around something he couldn't quite see from where he stood. She looked straight at him with a quiet certainty, her gaze steady though her body trembled slightly with age. He turned his head fully now, frowning, as if unsure whether she truly meant him. People rarely addressed him this way anymore, without title, without hesitation. "Excuse me?" he asked, voice even, though inside he felt a peculiar stirring. She smiled faintly, lines deepening around her eyes. Slowly she lifted her hand. Resting there was a small wooden toy car, its paint long faded, the edges worn smooth by time and touch. The sight struck him like a low, unexpected blow. He stopped walking entirely, his breath caught, chest tightening as though someone had pressed a hand against it. The shape of that car, simple and imperfect, was instantly familiar. For a moment the corridor dissolved around him. He was no longer standing in a hospital, no longer wearing the weight of a suit. He was a boy again, sitting cross-legged on a dusty floor, turning that little car across cracked tiles. A memory he had not called upon in years unfurled, suddenly vivid in its smallness. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the faint beep of a monitor somewhere down the hall. His fingers curled against the side of his coat, tightening unconsciously. The old woman tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for recognition. "You remember?" she said softly. He swallowed, his throat dry. His instinct was to speak, to demand an explanation, but no words came. Instead, he took a single step closer. The toy rested in her palm as though it had been waiting there all this time. He noticed the way her knuckles trembled faintly, the skin thin and almost translucent. The car itself carried scratches, its tiny wheels stubbornly stuck, yet it was whole. He exhaled slowly, a whisper of disbelief leaving him. "That I know this?" Something stirred nearby, a small, ordinary interruption. A nurse passed, pushing a cart that squeaked softly with each rotation of its wheel. She glanced briefly at the two of them, offering the old woman a gentle nod. "Evening, Mrs. Hale," she murmured, before moving on. The old woman nodded back, then turned her gaze once more to him. Her eyes glistened faintly beneath the hospital lights. "I kept it," she said. Her voice was neither weak nor strong, but held the steady cadence of truth. "For the day you said come back." His breath caught again, sharper this time. Something shifted inside him, an unease tangled with something deeper he could not name. He found himself staring not at the toy but at her face, at the way time had carved itself into her features. The corridor seemed narrower now, as though the walls leaned in to hear their exchange. He felt exposed, stripped of the armor he carried into every encounter. In this quiet place, with nothing but a broken toy car between them, he was no longer untouchable. A child's voice broke through from down the hall, soft, curious. "Grandma, is he your son?" The question came from a little girl in pigtails who had wandered from a nearby waiting room, clutching a coloring book. Her eyes were wide, directed at him, unbothered by the tension she'd stumbled into. The old woman's smile deepened, though it carried a trace of sadness. "Yes," she said gently, looking not at the girl but at him. "He is." The girl nodded with the simple acceptance only children possess. She skipped back toward the waiting room, her footsteps light and untroubled, leaving a faint echo behind her. He remained still, his gaze fixed on the old woman and the toy. A hollow ache settled in his chest, familiar yet long ignored. He thought of all the things he had collected in his life: towers of glass, fleets of cars, rooms filled with art, and none of them had the power this single wooden scrap now carried. His jaw tightened. His mind whispered in fragments, why her? Why now? Why this toy? Yet beneath the questions rose something else, something wordless, heavy and alive. He lowered himself slowly onto the bench beside her, the leather of his coat brushing softly against the fabric of her cardigan. The distance between them, both in space and in years, seemed suddenly fragile. For a moment neither spoke. The silence was no longer empty but full of memory, of recognition, of something quietly returning. The toy car remained between them, small against the vastness of all that had passed, yet impossibly important. The toy car rested in her palm, as if it belonged to the stillness of that corridor. Its edges, softened by years of holding, seemed almost fragile. The once bright paint had dulled into a quiet patchwork of faded blues and chipped corners. Yet something about it carried weight, a kind of stubborn presence that outlasted time itself. He found his eyes locked on it, unable to look away. The world around him, the polished floors and muted voices of nurses, faded into the background. All he saw was that small object, a relic of a childhood he had carefully buried beneath ambition and steel. The old woman shifted slightly, her cardigan brushing against the bench. The faint scent of lavender clung to her, soft against the sharper hospital air. She extended her hand a little closer, tilting it toward him so the toy caught the light. "Go on," she murmured. "Take a look." He hesitated. His hands, usually quick to sign contracts, and steady to guide decisions worth millions, felt strangely unsteady. For a brief moment, he considered walking away, leaving the corridor, leaving her, leaving the toy. Yet his body betrayed him. Slowly, as if reaching across decades, he extended his fingers and let them hover above the car. The wood was warm from her skin when he finally touched it. His thumb traced one of the grooves carved crudely along the side, perhaps by his own small hands, once upon a time. His chest tightened. He inhaled carefully, the breath catching before it could settle. He whispered, almost to himself, "I thought it was gone." Her gaze never wavered. "Nothing that matters are ever truly gone." The words fell between them like a gentle weight. He turned the toy over in his palm, feeling the unevenness of its edges. The wheels, stiff with age, refused to turn, but the shape carried the echo of motion all the same. Down the hall, a vending machine clinked softly as someone pressed its buttons. A can dropped with a hollow thud. The ordinary sound tugged him back, reminding him of where he stood. Yet, the toy in his hand rooted him in another time altogether. A boy's laugh floated from a waiting room nearby, bright, unguarded. The sound wrapped itself around him unexpectedly, pressing against the edges of his memory. For an instant he saw himself again at 2 years old, legs wobbling, hands gripping the toy too tightly, rolling it across the floor with stubborn determination. He blinked, and the image dissolved. The old woman studied his face quietly. Her hands folded neatly once more. "You held on to that car every day," she said. "Wouldn't said let anyone take it from you." He shifted, his jaw tightening. The words scratched at places inside him he preferred to keep closed. "And you, why did you keep it?" His voice was low, almost sharp, though not from anger, more from disbelief. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes glistened with something heavier. "Because you left it with me," she answered simply. "And I knew one day you stuck need to see it again." His fingers pressed against the toy, holding it tighter now. The simple explanation unsettled him more than any long story might have. It left no room for dismissal, no convenient escape. A soft interruption came from the side. A janitor pushing a mop bucket paused briefly near them. He glanced at the toy in the man's hand, then at the old woman. His brow furrowed with curiosity, but he said nothing. Instead, he gave a polite nod and continued down the corridor, the faint swish of mop water echoing behind him. The billionaire CEO, accustomed to command, to control, to polished surfaces and rehearsed meetings, sat quietly now, toy in hand, feeling the strangeness of being seen not as a figure of power but as someone's son. His thoughts pressed in on him. What does she want from me? Why hold on to this scrap of wood for so long? But deeper, another voice rose, quieter yet more insistent. Why does it matter so much to me that she did? The corridor's lights buzz faintly above, a gentle static filling the silence. He stared down at the car again, letting its details etch themselves into his mind. He noticed how the paint clung stubbornly to the corners, how one wheel had a small crack running through it. Imperfect, yes, but still intact. A strange calm crept into him as he held it. His fingers, once restless, stilled against the worn surface. For the first time in a long while, he felt the sharp edges of his ambition soften, if only by a fraction. The old woman leaned back against the bench, her eyes closing briefly as if resting. When she opened them again, her gaze was gentle, steady. "It's yours," she said. The words landed softly, almost too softly. He realized then that the toy was more than wood and faded paint. It was a thread, thin, fragile but unbroken, that tied him to a beginning he had long tried to forget. He sat in silence, clutching the car, listening to the corridor's quiet hum. Somewhere down the hall, a child's laughter rang out again, mingling with the faint squeak of cart wheels and the distant murmur of voices. Ordinary sounds, yet now they pressed against him with meaning. The toy in his hand felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. And he knew, though he could not yet say it aloud, that this encounter was not something he could walk away from. The toy sat heavily in his hand, though it weighed almost nothing. His thumb moved slowly along its edge, tracing grooves he hadn't touched in decades. The corridor around him blurred into a haze of soft light and distant murmurs. It felt as if the small object had opened a door somewhere deep inside, one he had bricked over long ago. A flicker of memory rose, unsteady at first, like the faint glow of a candle. He saw a boy sitting cross-legged on a cracked tile floor. Dust collected in the corners of the room, but the boy didn't notice. He was laughing to himself, nudging the car forward with tiny, determined hands. The wheels stuttered, stuck more often than they rolled, but each push was followed by another and another. The boy's face lit with triumph, even when nothing seemed to move. His chest tightened as the vision sharpened. He could almost hear the hollow clatter of the wooden wheels hitting uneven stone. He remembered the smell too, old plaster mixed with soap and bread. It came rushing back with such force that he caught his breath. He blinked hard, grounding himself in the present. The hospital corridor came back into focus, the hum of lights, the faint shuffle of a nurse's shoes somewhere nearby. Yet the memory refused to let go. It pressed against him with quiet insistence, demanding to be seen. The old woman Sep's voice broke gently into the silence. "You love that car. Wouldn't it put it down, not even to sleep?" He didn't answer. Words felt clumsy against the tide rising within him. His fingers gripped the toy more tightly, as though it might slip away again. A faint sound interrupted, ordinary, almost unremarkable. A child dropped a paper cup near the vending machine down the hall. It rolled across the floor with a hollow spin before coming to rest near his shoe. The boy who had dropped it hurried over, scooping it up with an embarrassed grin. "Sorry, sir," he whispered, before darting back to his mother. The CEO looked down at the cup, then at the toy in his hand. The sight of the boy's small fingers clutching the cup tugged at something raw inside him. "I was that small once," he thought. "I held this toy just like that." The realization felt almost foreign. His life now was a map of towering offices, endless schedules, numbers stacked upon numbers. He couldn't remember the last time he had paused to think of himself as a child, small, unsteady, needing something to hold. The old woman studied him quietly, her face patient, her eyes filled with a tenderness that unsettled him more than any business rival ever had. "It was all you had," she murmured. "But it was enough to make you smile." Her words pressed deeper into him than he cared to admit. He tried to summon his usual armor, the practiced composure that had carried him through countless negotiations. Yet, it wavered now, unsteady against the flood of something older, something gentler. He turned the car over again, studying its cracks. The chipped paint seemed to whisper of hands smaller than his, of days long before glass towers and boardrooms. A faint warmth crept into his chest, almost painful in its unfamiliarity. For a moment he allowed himself to sit inside that memory. He pictured the boy again, himself rolling the car back and forth with fierce concentration, laughing when it tipped to one side, stubbornly setting it upright again. There was no wealth, no power, no world demanding more. Just a toy, and the feeling that it belonged to him. His breath shuddered as he exhaled. How did I forget this? The corridor stretched quiet around him, though every sound seemed sharper now, the squeak of cart wheels, the gentle cough from a nearby room, the faint hum of air through vents. Ordinary sounds, yet each carried him further into reflection. He realized with an ache that he had spent years building walls high enough to drown out such small echoes. But here, in the stillness of the hospital, with this toy pressing into his palm, the echoes found him again. A small voice interrupted his thoughts. The same little girl from earlier had wandered back, her coloring book clutched under one arm. She peered at the toy with innocent curiosity. That car's really old, she said, matter-of-factly. He glanced at her, caught off guard by her bluntness. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a short breath, something almost like a laugh, though it was thin and unsteady. Yes, he said quietly. It is. The girl tilted her head, studying him. You still like it? The question hung there, simple yet piercing. He looked down at the car again, his fingers tightening around it. The answer rose in him, unspoken, undeniable. The old woman placed her hand lightly on his arm. Her touch was gentle, feather-light, but it carried the weight of recognition. It was part of you, she said. He swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. The girl, satisfied with his silence, skipped away again, her footsteps fading into the waiting room. He sat back, shoulders heavy, eyes fixed on the toy. A quiet truth formed in him: this car wasn't just a relic, it was proof that once, long ago, he had been seen, held, remembered. And as he sat there, the spark of that memory flickering in his chest, he realized it was not gone. It had been waiting all this time, patient as the woman before him. The bench creaked softly as the old woman shifted, drawing her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The hospital corridor carried on with its muted rhythm, distant footsteps, the faint beeping of machines behind closed doors, the steady hum of lights above. Yet here, on this narrow strip of wood and cushion, time seemed to pause. She looked at him not with curiosity, but with the calm certainty of someone who had been waiting a very long time. Her hands folded neatly over her lap, though he noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, a tremor that stilled whenever they touched the toy car. You must be wondering, she said gently, her voice lined with age but steady, why I held on to it all these years. He said nothing at first. His thumb pressed against the side of the toy, tracing the old crack along its wheel. His throat felt dry, as though words, if spoken, might splinter under their own weight. She leaned back slightly, her gaze unfocused for a moment, as if looking somewhere past the corridor's walls. I was a caretaker then, at the home. Her voice softened on the last word. I remember your laugh, how you'd sit on the floor, stubborn as anything, pushing that car across tiles that were never quite smooth. You didn't mind, you made your own road. A hollow ache stirred in his chest. The memory she painted matched the flicker that had just returned to him, so exact it unsettled him. He caught himself gripping the car tighter, as though afraid it might vanish if he let it go. Her eyes shifted back to him, steady, searching. When the day came that you left, you dropped it. You were too small to notice. Or maybe too distracted. She paused, her lips tightening faintly. I picked it up, thought of giving it back, but you were already gone. The silence that followed pressed against him. He imagined her standing there decades younger, holding the toy in her hand, while the boy he once was disappeared into another world. And so you kept it? His voice was low, almost rough, carrying more disbelief than question. I kept it, she said simply. Not because I thought you'd come running back for it, but because I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was yours, and something in me said you might need it again, one day. Her words settled between them like dust, quiet but impossible to ignore. A small interruption shifted the moment. A nurse walked past, pushing a metal stand with a squeaky wheel. She glanced briefly at the old woman, offering a smile. Mrs. Hale, do you need anything? The woman shook her head. I said fine, thank you. The nurse nodded and moved on, leaving behind a faint scent of coffee and hand sanitizer. The interruption passed, but the weight of the story lingered. He stared at the toy, the silence stretching once more. Inside his thoughts twisted. She kept this all this time, not for herself. For me. Why? What does she expect now? Yet beneath the questions another feeling surfaced, unsteady, almost unbearable: gratitude. The old woman tilted her head slightly, studying him. You've grown into someone the world must look up to. Her eyes softened. But I don't see the man in the papers, or on the screens. I see the boy who laughed with this toy in his hand. Her words cut through the layers of armor he had built. He shifted in his seat, shoulders stiff, gaze fixed on the floor tiles. A faint reflection of the overhead lights shimmered across the polished surface, and for a moment he saw not himself but a child sitting there, legs curled, toy in hand. He inhaled carefully, slow, measured. I don't remember much of that time, he admitted, the words feeling unfamiliar on his tongue. That's all right, she replied. I remembered for you. His head lifted slightly at that. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than anything else she had said. He turned his gaze toward her, noticing the way her eyes seemed brighter, despite the tired lines around them. Her cardigan sleeve slipped back a little, revealing a wrist marked with pale, delicate veins. She folded her hands once more, as though anchoring herself in the moment. Children come and go, she continued softly. Some stay, some are taken away, but each one leaves something behind. Laughter, tears, a toy on the floor. She gave a small smile. Yours just happened to stay with me. Another sound interrupted. The faint rustle of papers as a man in a suit walked past, talking quietly into his phone. His polished shoes echoed against the floor, brisk and sharp. He didn't glance their way, and within seconds his voice faded into the distance. The contrast struck him, one world rushing forward with deals and deadlines, another sitting quietly on this bench, holding on to something that time couldn't erase. He looked at the toy again, his hand tightening around it. His thoughts whispered she kept this, for me, not for herself. For me! The realization pressed against him until it became almost unbearable. His chest rose with a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The old woman's voice was gentle when she spoke again. I always believed, she said, that the things we love have a way of finding us again. He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze at last. For the first time in years, he felt his composure falter, not in the face of loss or defeat, but in the quiet truth of being remembered. The corridor stretched on around them, filled with ordinary sounds, but here, on this narrow bench, something extraordinary had unfolded. A story not told in headlines or contracts, but in the simple act of one woman keeping a child's toy, waiting for the day it might matter again. And as he sat there, the weight of her story pressing gently into him, he realized it already did. He sat back against the bench, the toy car balanced between his fingers, its worn edges pressed into his palm, a pressure small but steady like the weight of an old truth that refused to be ignored. His gaze stayed fixed on it, though his mind moved restlessly. For years, he had carried himself with unshakable composure. In meetings, on screens, in crowded auditoriums, he was always the man in control, voice measured, face unreadable. His shield had been perfected, built layer by layer, until it felt like part of his skin. Yet here, under the thin light of a hospital corridor, with a fragile old woman watching him, that shield felt thinner than ever. A faint sound interrupted, a child's laugh drifting from a nearby room, followed by the squeak of sneakers against linoleum. The noise was ordinary, harmless. Still, it reached into him like a hand, pulling at a memory he hadn't invited. He shifted in his seat, shoulders tightening. Why does this matter? He asked himself.
It's just a toy.
Just wood and paint, but the thought rang hollow. His fingers betrayed him, curling tighter around it. The old woman's gaze was steady. She didn't speak, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any words she might have offered. It was as if she could see through him, through the polished veneer, to the boy he had left behind. He let out a slow breath. His chest felt taut, like a string drawn too tightly. He tried to summon his usual calm, the steady mask that had carried him through negotiations and confrontations alike. But it wavered. His jaw clenched, then released, then clenched again. Finally he spoke, his voice low. You kept this all these years. Why? You don't even know me anymore. Her lips curved into a faint smile, lined with sorrow and warmth both. I know enough, she said. I know the child who once held it, and sometimes that sips the truest part of us. The words pressed into him like a quiet weight. He looked down at the car again, studying the chipped paint, the stubborn crack along one wheel. He felt suddenly raw, as though the object in his hand had stripped away the armor he had spent decades building. A nurse passed by, her shoes squeaking lightly. She carried a tray with 2 cups of tea, steam rising gently from them. The soft scent of chamomile floated briefly in the air as she walked past. It was such a small, ordinary thing, yet it made him realize how long it had been since he had noticed simple comforts like that. His throat tightened. When did I stop seeing small things? When did I trade them for towers of glass and steel? He pressed his lips together, fighting the heat rising in his chest. For years, he had been admired, feared, respected, but rarely, if ever, had he been seen. Truly seen. And here, by this fragile woman in a faded cardigan, it felt unbearable to be recognized in such a way. The silence stretched between them until it felt fragile. He broke it with a whisper, almost involuntary. I don't know how to be that boy anymore. Her hand, thin and trembling, reached toward his. She didn't take the toy from him, but rested her palm lightly against the back of his hand. The warmth was faint but steady. That boy is still here, she said softly. You just stopped listening to him. The words slid past his defenses, sinking deeper than he wanted them to. He felt his eyes sting suddenly, sharp and unexpected. He blinked quickly, willing the feeling away. But the pressure remained, caught between his chest and throat. A voice rang out from farther down the corridor. A young man calling to his grandmother, asking if she wanted water. The sound echoed briefly before fading again. Another ordinary interruption, but it struck him, reminding him of connections he had long dismissed as distractions. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself. Yet when he exhaled, it was unsteady, almost shuddered. He rubbed his thumb along the toy's surface, the motion both grounding and unsettling. His mind whispered fragments. You don't have time for this. You can't afford to feel. This doesn't matter. But beneath those thoughts, quieter yet undeniable, came another voice.
It matters because it's real.
He closed his eyes briefly, pressing the toy to his palm, as though it might steady him. The shield he had lived behind felt cracked, thin, almost transparent. When he opened his eyes again, the old woman was still watching him with the same steady patience. There was no judgment in her gaze, no demand, only recognition, and it shook him more than anger ever could. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than he expected. I built everything so I wouldn't feel small again. And yet here I am, small. Her smile deepened, soft, almost sad. There is no shame in being small, she said. There is only shame in forgetting that even small things matter. He let the words sink in, the corridor around them stretching with its muted hum. For the first time in years, he felt his shield crack, not in defeat, but in the quiet release of finally being seen. The toy car sat between them, small and ordinary, yet it carried the weight of something far larger, the reminder that beneath the empire he had built, there was still a boy who once laughed at the sound of wooden wheels rolling across stone. And in that moment he realized he could no longer pretend the boy wasn't there. The toy rested in his hand, small against his palm, yet carrying a weight he could not name. The corridor stretched on with its quiet rhythm, the faint beeping of monitors, the distant shuffle of nurses, the muted murmur of voices behind closed doors. Around him the world felt unchanged. Inside him something was shifting. The old woman leaned back against the bench, her breathing soft but steady. Her gaze lingered on him with the kind of patience only years could teach. She didn't press him with questions or force words into the silence. She simply sat there as though her presence was enough. For a long moment, he let himself stay in that silence. His thumb moved back and forth along the car's chipped paint. The texture of the wood beneath his skin was grounding, pulling him away from boardrooms and deadlines, into a place far older, far smaller. A sudden burst of laughter broke the stillness. 2 children ran past the corridor, one chasing the other with clumsy, uneven steps. Their shoes slapped against the floor, echoing like quick, playful beats of a drum. The boy held a balloon in his hand, its ribbon trailing wildly behind him, while the girl clutched a half-empty juice box. Their noise was ordinary, harmless, but it stirred something unexpected in him. His gaze followed them as they disappeared around the corner. A quiet thought surfaced. That was me once. Running, laughing, not knowing I had anything to lose. He swallowed hard. His chest rose with a breath that felt heavier than air should. He turned his head slightly toward the old woman. They remind me. He paused, words faltering. Of something I had forgotten. Her smile deepened, lined with quiet sorrow and warmth. Children carry the truth in them, she said softly. Even when we grow, the echoes stay. He shifted, his hand tightening around the toy. The question rose before he could stop it. Why, remember me? His voice was low, rough at the edges. There must have been so many. Her eyes glistened faintly in the light. Because you were mine for a while, she answered simply. Even if only for a season. The words caught him off guard. He looked away quickly, staring at the floor tiles as if their smooth polished surface could anchor him. A faint reflection of the ceiling lights shimmered back at him, pale and restless. Mine for a while. The phrase circled his thoughts, quiet but insistent. He had built empires to ensure he belonged to no one, beholden to nothing. Yet here, a fragile woman in a faded cardigan, claimed him with a truth so simple it undid him. He pressed the toy car against his palm, until the edges dug into his skin. The discomfort grounded him, but it didn't erase the ache rising in his chest. Another sound broke through, a volunteer passing by with a cart of magazines, offering them to waiting families. She paused briefly near the bench. Would you like something to read? She asked kindly. The old woman shook her head with a polite smile. He didn't answer, his throat too tight. The volunteer moved on, her cart rattling softly as she disappeared down the hall. He exhaled, the breath uneven. I've spent years proving myself, he admitted, surprising even himself with the confession. I thought if I built enough, owned enough, I could silence that feeling of being left behind. His voice trailed off, heavy with the weight of unspoken years. The old woman's hand moved lightly, resting over his where it held the toy. Her touch was warm, trembling, yet steady. And has it worked? She asked gently. His jaw tightened. He wanted to say yes, to reclaim the certainty that had always carried him, but the word wouldn't come. Instead, silence answered for him, thick and unyielding. Her thumb brushed faintly over the back of his hand, a gesture so small yet filled with the tenderness he hadn't felt in decades. You don't have to prove yourself to me, she said. You were enough before you ever built anything. The words struck him deeper than he expected. He closed his eyes briefly, his grip on the toy loosening, a warmth spread in his chest, unfamiliar yet steady, as if something long buried had shifted. When he opened his eyes again, he found her watching him with quiet patience. And for the first time, he didn't look away. He let the connection hold, fragile yet undeniable. A small boy passed by, tugging at his father's hand. He glanced at the toy car in the CEO's hand, and grinned. Cool car, he said shyly, before being pulled along. The man almost laughed, soft, unsteady but real. He turned the toy over once more, seeing it not only as a relic but as a bridge. A reminder, a thread pulling him back to something he had thought lost forever. The old woman Sep's voice came softly, steady. You don't have to go back to being that boy, but you can carry him with you. He nodded faintly, words caught in his throat. In that moment, sitting on a hospital bench with a toy car in his hand, and an old woman beside him, he felt something he hadn't known he needed, a bond, fragile but real, rekindled from the embers of memory. And though the world outside would never know this moment, he understood its weight. It was not about power, or legacy, or empire. It was about being seen, remembered, and perhaps, after all this time, claimed. The toy sat lightly in his hand now, not clutched so tightly as before, but held with a care that surprised him. Its edges pressed into his palm in a way that no longer felt sharp but grounding. The corridor's rhythm continued around them, nurses passing, carts squeaking, doors opening and closing, but he noticed it all differently now, as if each sound carried a slower weight. The old woman adjusted her cardigan, her fingers brushing over the buttons with a delicate patience. Her eyes lingered on him, soft yet steady, as if she was waiting for him to ask the question that sat heavy in the air. He finally spoke, his voice low. Why keep it? Why hold on to this for so long? His thumb ran over the toy Sep's chipped paint again, a motion that had already become instinct. It was nothing, just a scrap of wood, a child's distraction. She tilted her head slightly, her smile faint but sure. because it wasn't Stus and nothing, not to you. He looked down, jaw tightening. That was a lifetime ago. Isep lived entire worlds since then. Yes, she said, nodding, but even so, no child should be forgotten. The words struck him harder than he expected. They echoed in the narrow space of the corridor, settling into him with a heaviness that resisted explanation. He stared at the floor, the reflection of the overhead lights smudged across its polish. His thoughts twisted, restless, forgotten. That's what I feared. That's why I built everything, to make sure the world remembered me. A sound interrupted, small, ordinary, but jarring in its timing. A boy ran down the hall holding a paper airplane, its wings bent unevenly. He launched it with clumsy excitement, and it landed just short of the bench, skidding across the floor until it brushed against the CEO's shoe. The boy's face flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry, mister," he mumbled, hurrying forward to pick it up. The man surprised himself. Instead of brushing it off, he bent slightly, picking up the airplane before the child could. He handed it back, the paper crinkling softly in his fingers. "Flies better if you fold the tip tighter," he said quietly. The boy's eyes lit up, and he nodded quickly. "Thanks." He ran back toward the waiting room, already unfolding and refolding the tip with determined hands. The old woman Sep's gaze lingered on him, her smile deepening. "You see," she murmured. "Even now you remember how to care." He let out a slow breath, unsettled by how natural the small exchange had felt. His hand tightened again around the toy.
You talk as if the sea lifted it slightly.
"Changes anything." "It already has," she said softly. Her certainty pressed against him, both comforting and unbearable. He leaned back slightly, running his free hand across his knee in a restless motion. "I've spent my life proving I didn't need anyone, that I could survive without ties, without anyone remembering me." His words came rough, strained, and yet, here you are, holding on for decades, for me. She didn't flinch. Her voice carried the quiet strength of truth. Because sometimes one person is enough, one person to remember, one person to keep a place for you. He turned his head toward her then, searching her lined face for something, an explanation perhaps, or a crack in her certainty. But all he saw was steadiness, softened by age but unbroken. His chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to dismiss her words as sentimental, but he couldn't. The toy in his hand was proof enough. A nurse's shoes squeaked faintly as she passed, carrying a clipboard tucked under her arm. The ordinary interruption grounded him again in the hospital's rhythm. But instead of brushing it off, he noticed the details, the way her hair had slipped from its bun, the faint shadow of tiredness under her eyes. Small things, human things. He turned back to the old woman, voice quieter now. "Do you ever regret it, keeping me, even if only in memory?" She shook her head slowly. "No, because it meant you were never truly gone." His fingers pressed into the toy, holding it with renewed weight.
He felt the edges bite into his skin, but he didn't loosen his grip.
A thought rose in him, fragile yet insistent. If she hadn't kept it, would I even know who I was anymore? The silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. It was full of questions, of truths, of something fragile being uncovered. The old woman leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be the boy you were. You don't have to be the man the world thinks you are. But you do have to choose who you will be now." The words settled deep, pressing against something he had avoided for years. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. For the first time in a long while, he didn't have an immediate answer. The toy sat warm in his palm, ordinary and small, yet it had already begun to feel like more than a memory. It felt like a question, one he could no longer ignore. The corridor had emptied for the moment, leaving behind only the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint, steady rhythm of distant machines. He sat there, shoulders heavy, the toy car cradled in his palm. The wood was warm now, shaped not only by years, but by the simple heat of his grip. For the first time in a long while, no one demanded his attention. No boardroom waited, no screens glowed with urgent messages. The silence should have been comforting, but instead it pressed into him like a weight. He stared at the toy, watching the light catch along its edges. The tiny crack in its wheel, the paint worn smooth. It all seemed to whisper back to him, not in words, but in memories, in feelings he had spent years burying beneath layers of control. What am I doing here? He thought. Why does this matter so much? His chest rose with a slow breath, but it didn't steady him. He felt restless inside his own skin. All those years of pushing forward, building, conquering, he thought they had freed him from the small boy who once sat alone with a toy car. But here it was, in his hand, refusing to be forgotten. The old woman sat quietly beside him. She didn't speak, didn't push. Her stillness was both unsettling and comforting, as if she knew that silence itself was part of the answer he was looking for. A sudden interruption stirred the air. A door down the hall opened, and a young mother stepped out holding her baby. The child whimpered, then gave a sharp cry, the sound echoing against the walls. The mother rocked him gently, whispering soothing words as she walked past. He turned his head slightly, watching the scene. The baby's small fists waved in the air, clutching at nothing, desperate for comfort. The sight gripped him unexpectedly. His fingers tightened around the toy, pressing it into his palm, until the edges dug sharply into his skin. That was me once, he realized, crying, reaching for something to hold. And this was what I had. The thought unsettled him. For decades, he had convinced himself that his empire, the glass towers, the contracts, the power, was proof he had escaped that smallness. Yet, as he sat here, watching a mother soothe her child, he felt the truth pressing in. The boy he had been was never gone. He had been waiting, silent, patient. The baby's cries softened as the mother disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a silence that felt deeper than before. He looked down at the toy again, his vision blurring for a moment. He blinked hard, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. The old woman Sep's voice broke the quiet, soft but steady. It is an Astad weakness to remember. It's Sep's how we find our way. He didn't answer. His mind circled with thoughts that refused to settle. I built everything so I wouldn't be forgotten. But she never forgot, not once. Even when I didn't know she was there. His jaw tightened. He felt anger rise briefly, not at her, but at himself, at the years wasted running from something that had always been waiting. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the toy still clenched in his hand. The corridor lights buzzed faintly overhead, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint trace of lavender from the old woman's cardigan. Every detail felt sharper now, as if the world itself was pressing him to notice what he had ignored for too long. He closed his eyes, letting the silence wash over him. Inside, a reckoning unfolded, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. He saw the boy he once was, sitting on the floor with the toy car, laughing at nothing but the joy of movement. He saw the man he had become, standing above cities, his face on screens, his life measured in billions, and between them, a gap he had never dared to bridge. The toy sat between those two worlds, ordinary yet unyielding. His breath shuddered as he exhaled. What have I been chasing? A soft sound pulled him back. The old woman shifted, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. The touch was barely there, but it steadied him. You don't have to carry it all alone, she whispered. The words sank into him, quiet but relentless. He had carried the weight of empire, of proving himself, of never being forgotten. Yet here she was, reminding him he had never been truly alone to begin with. He opened his eyes slowly, staring down at the car in his palm. The light glinted off its edges, catching on the chipped paint. For the first time he didn't see it as broken. He saw it as something that had survived. His shoulders lowered, the tension easing slightly. The silence around him no longer felt heavy. It felt like space. Space to breathe, space to remember, space to choose. He leaned back against the bench, letting the stillness hold him. Inside, the reckoning continued. Not finished, not simple, but begun. And though no one else in the world would ever know of this moment, he understood its weight. Here, with a worn wooden toy in his hand, and an old woman beside him, he was finally facing the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. It wasn't the empire that defined him. It was the boy who once laughed at the sound of wooden wheels across stone. The boy who had never been forgotten. The toy car was still warm in his palm when he returned the next morning. The hospital smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the air humming with the low murmur of voices and the squeak of wheels against polished floors. He walked slower this time, his stride less sharp, less rehearsed. The polished armor he wore so easily in boardrooms felt distant here, almost unnecessary. When he entered the corridor, she was already waiting on the bench. Her cardigan hung loosely around her shoulders, and her hands rested gently in her lap. Her eyes lifted when she saw him, soft and steady, as though she had expected him all along. "You came back," she said. He nodded. No flourish, no excuse. Just the quiet truth. Yes. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her, the toy car still in his hand. He had carried it with him through the night, setting it on his desk while city lights glowed outside his office window. He hadn't been able to look at his spreadsheets or contracts without glancing at it, feeling its quiet weight pulling him back here. She smiled faintly, her gaze falling to the toy. "It stayed with you." "It did," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, almost unsteady. "And so did you." For a moment, they sat in silence. The corridor stretched around them, filled with the sounds of ordinary life, footsteps, coughs, laughter in the distance. Yet the quiet between them felt full, carrying the weight of something unspoken. A sudden interruption broke the stillness. A little boy stopped in front of them, his cheeks flushed from running. He looked at the toy in the man Sep's hand, his eyes wide with admiration. "Cool car," he said, grinning. "Does it still work?" The CEO looked down at the toy, then back at the boy. He opened his hand, showing the cracked wheel. "Not like it used to," he admitted. The boy shrugged with the easy wisdom of childhood. "Doesn't set matter. Old toys are the best ones. They set been loved more." Before he could answer, the boy's mother called him from down the hall. The child gave them a quick wave and ran off, his laughter echoing behind him. The old woman chuckled softly. "Children see things we forget." He let the words settle. "Love more." He turned the toy slowly in his hand, and for the first time he didn't see it as broken. He saw it as something that had endured. He drew in a slow breath. "I want to do something," he said at last. "Not just for me, for the children still there, for the ones who will come after." Her eyes glistened faintly. She didn't speak, but the quiet curve of her smile told him she understood. That evening he called his assistants, not with the clipped tone they were used to, but with a steadiness they had never heard from him before. He arranged for donations, millions, more than the orphanage had ever dreamed of. He set up a foundation in her name, ensuring children would have care, toys, books, and a home that did not forget them. But it wasn't the money that mattered most, it was the way he returned to the orphanage itself. When he stepped through its doors days later, the air was thick with dust and memory. The walls were faded, the tiles cracked, the same ones he remembered from a lifetime ago. Children ran through the halls, their laughter filling the space with life. Some stopped to stare at him, curious about the stranger in the sharp suit. He bent down, loosening his tie, his movements slower now. A girl approached him shyly, holding a puzzle piece in her small hand. "Can you help me find where this goes?" He knelt beside her, the toy car still in his pocket, and took the piece from her hand. Together, they leaned over the puzzle spread across the floor. His fingers traced the edges until he found the right space, clicking it gently into place. The girl smiled, her eyes bright with triumph. Something inside him softened. He realized then that redemption didn't come from the size of a donation or the name on a plaque. It came from this kneeling on the floor, helping a child piece together something small but important. The old woman stood in the doorway, watching quietly. She didn't need to say anything, the look in her eyes said enough. That night, he sat once more on the hospital bench beside her. The toy car rested between them, its edges catching the light. "I can change the years I lost," he said softly. "But I can choose what to do with the years ahead." Her hand brushed lightly against his, trembling but steady. "That's all anyone can do." He nodded, the weight in his chest easing for the first time in years. The toy no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a promise, one he intended to keep. The car ride back to the orphanage was quiet. The city passed by his window in a blur of glass and steel, towers gleaming against the pale sky. He had once measured his worth in those towers, in the sharp edges of progress and power. But today they felt distant, almost irrelevant. In his coat pocket, the small wooden toy pressed against him with a steady weight, a reminder of something far older, far truer. When he stepped through the orphanage gates, the scent of damp earth and faded paint rose to greet him. The building was smaller than he remembered. Time had shrunk it in his mind, but the echoes inside were the same. The tiled floor carried faint cracks, the walls bore the faint scrape of years, and the air was filled with the soft chaos of children's laughter. He paused in the doorway, his hand brushing the toy in his pocket. The sound of feet running, voices calling, and the rustle of paper toys filled the space. For a moment he closed his eyes. I was here once, small, forgotten, yet remembered after all. The children noticed him quickly. A few stared wide-eyed, whispering to one another. One boy tugged at another's sleeve, pointing at the man in the fine coat. But their hesitation dissolved when a little girl walked up to him boldly, a ragged teddy bear in her arms. "Who are you?" she asked, tilting her head. He crouched slightly, meeting her gaze. His voice was quieter than usual, free of the clipped certainty that usually followed him. "Someone who used to sit on this floor, just like you." Her brow furrowed. "You? In that suit?" The corner of his mouth lifted faintly. "Not always in a suit." The girl studied him, then nodded as if deciding to believe him. She reached out, touching the edge of his sleeve with her small fingers before running back to her friends. Their laughter filled the hall again, unbothered, free. He walked farther inside, his steps slower, more careful. He found the old woman waiting in the corner, her cardigan wrapped around her like a shawl. She watched him with eyes that carried both pride and sadness. He joined her quietly, pulling the toy car from his pocket. The children gathered quickly, drawn by curiosity, their voices bubbled around him. "What's Sep's that? Is it broken? Can I play with it?" He held it carefully, showing them its edges. "This was mine," he said softly. "The only toy I had when I was your age." A hush fell for a moment, as if the gravity of his words pressed into their small shoulders. Then a boy Sep's hand shot up. "Does it still roll?" He placed it gently on the floor and gave it a push. The wheels stuttered, catching on their cracks, but the car moved a short distance before stopping. The children clapped anyway, their cheers filling the hall with warmth. One of the older girls stepped forward, her voice bright. "You should keep it safe." He nodded slowly. "Yes, that's Sep's exactly what I want to do." He stood, carrying the toy toward a glass case in the front hall, a display once meant for trophies and faded photographs. The caretaker opened it for him, and he set the car gently inside. Its small worn frame caught the light, glowing faintly against the glass. "This belongs here," he said quietly. His voice trembled slightly, but he didn't fight it, with family. The old woman stood beside him, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. He looked at her, the words pressing deep into him. Home, a word he had once thought belonged only to others. Yet here, surrounded by laughter, and the smell of old plaster and warm bread, he felt its weight in his chest. A child tugged at his sleeve again, the same bold little girl with the teddy bear. "Will you come back?" she asked, her eyes wide with unspoken hope. He crouched once more, meeting her gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "I promise." Her smile broke wide, unguarded. She ran off to tell the others, their voices rising in a chorus of excitement. He stayed a moment longer, watching the toy car glint in the case, surrounded by the sound of children who would never feel forgotten the way he once had. The empire he had built felt small compared to this, the simple act of being remembered, and remembering in return. As he walked out of the orphanage, the late afternoon sun spilled across the courtyard, warm against his face. The world outside still waited, its towers, its demands, its endless hunger. But he carried something else now, a promise. A bond, a home. And for the first time in years, he felt whole.